What if you woke up tomorrow hearing voices nobody else could hear? Today, you'd call a doctor. 3,000 years ago, you might call a priest. And depending on where you lived, that decision could save your life or destroy it. Because the history of mental illness is really the history of how societies treat people they don't understand. And that story begins long before civilization existed, long before medicine, long before science, back when strange behavior had only one explanation: something supernatural. Archaeologists discovered ancient skulls with perfectly carved holes. Not accidents, not battle wounds, deliberate holes. The procedure was called trepanation, and it sounds exactly as terrifying as it was. Many believed a spirit was trapped inside the skull. The solution? Give the spirit a way out. Headaches? Spirit. Voices? Spirit. Confusion? Also spirit. It sounds absurd, but there was a problem. Some patients survived. For years, their bones actually grew back around the hole. And even stranger, different civilizations invented the same procedure independently. Peru, Africa, Europe, thousands of miles apart, yet they all reached the same conclusion. When the mind breaks, the answer must be inside the head. Then civilization arrived, and things became more complicated. In Mesopotamia, mental illness wasn't a medical problem. It was a divine problem. If you suffered mentally, the gods were sending a message, and that message was usually not good. Babylonians called it the hand of a god. Your suffering meant you had offended something powerful. The challenge was discovering which god. That responsibility belonged to special priests. They studied dreams, behaviors, patterns. In some ways, they were early investigators of the human mind. Their explanations were wrong, but their observations were surprisingly detailed. They recorded symptoms we would recognize today: depression, mania, hallucinations. Human beings hadn't changed. Only the explanations had. Then came Egypt. And Egypt saw something others didn't. Maybe mental suffering wasn't only spiritual. Maybe it was physical too. That idea changed everything. Egyptian healers prescribed rest, music, gardens, peaceful environments. Not exactly modern therapy, but surprisingly close. Some patients even slept in sacred temples, waiting for dreams that could guide their recovery. The treatment wasn't perfect, but it contained an important idea. People suffering mentally deserved care. Not punishment, not blame, care. And then Greece arrived with two completely different answers. The first answer came from the gods. The second came from medicine. And for centuries, those two ideas fought each other. Some Greeks believed madness was a gift, not a curse. A message from something higher. A doorway into truths ordinary people could never see. If the gods spoke through you, then your madness might be sacred. Prophets were expected to be different. Oracles were expected to be strange. The more unusual your mind seemed, the more seriously some people listened. Plato even described different kinds of divine madness: prophetic madness, poetic madness, ritual madness, and even the madness of love. In his view, complete rationality wasn't always an advantage. Sometimes madness revealed deeper truths. It was a remarkable idea, but another Greek disagreed. His name was Hippocrates, and he would change medicine forever. Hippocrates rejected supernatural explanations. He believed mental illness came from the body, more specifically, the brain. That may sound obvious today. Back then, it was revolutionary. Hippocrates argued that strange behavior wasn't caused by angry gods. It was caused by physical imbalances. Something inside the person, not outside them. His theory wasn't completely correct, but the direction was. For the first time, mental illness was being treated as a medical condition, not a spiritual punishment. That single shift would echo through history. Centuries later, Rome inherited many Greek ideas, including their theories about the mind. Roman doctors continued searching for physical causes. They prescribed exercise, healthy diets, warm baths, massage, and something surprisingly familiar: conversation. Doctors listened to patients describe their suffering, their fears, their thoughts, their struggles. It wasn't modern therapy, but it was getting closer. For a moment, progress seemed possible. Rome had a darker side, because not everyone who was labeled mad was actually mad. Some were inconvenient. Some were embarrassing. Some simply stood in the way of power. Roman law created a category for people considered mentally incapable. Once declared incapable, a person could lose control of their property, their rights, even their freedom, and that created a dangerous opportunity. Because who decides what counts as madness? A doctor? A judge? A family member with something to gain? The question still matters today. Then Rome fell, and Europe entered a very different world. The medieval era, a time often remembered for superstition. But the truth is more complicated. Some people believed mental illness was caused by demons. Others believed it was a test from God. Others simply didn't know. And when people don't understand suffering, they often create stories to explain it. Some of those stories helped. Others caused enormous harm. Exorcisms became common. Religious rituals became treatments. Yet, even during this period, something unexpected was happening elsewhere, far from medieval Europe. A different civilization was building a different future. While Europe debated demons, the Islamic world was building hospitals, places designed to heal, not punish, not imprison, heal. One man stood at the center of this change. His name was Avicenna, one of the greatest physicians in history. He believed mental illness was a medical condition, not a spiritual failure, not a punishment from above, a condition that deserved treatment. And that idea was centuries ahead of its time. Long before modern psychology existed, he was already asking the right questions. Questions the world would spend centuries trying to answer. He described conditions that sounded remarkably familiar. Depression, anxiety, mania, obsessive thoughts. The names were different, but the people were not. Human suffering looked much the same, whether it happened in Baghdad or London in 1025 or 2025. The symptoms changed very little. The explanations changed constantly. Avicenna also believed conversation could help healing, not just medicine, not just rituals. Words mattered. Understanding mattered. Listening mattered. That sounds obvious today. It was revolutionary back then. And unlike many civilizations before him, he didn't stop at theory. Hospitals were built. Patients were admitted. Physicians monitored their recovery. Music was used as treatment. Gardens were part of recovery. Peaceful surroundings were considered medicine. The goal was not control. The goal was healing. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because history shows something surprising. The greatest advances rarely begin with technology. They begin with a change in perspective, a new way of seeing people, a new way of understanding suffering, and a new answer to a simple question. What do we owe people who are struggling? Every civilization answered differently. Some answered with fear. Some answered with punishment. Some answered with exclusion. But a few answered with compassion, and those answers changed history. Yet history was about to take another turn, because Europe would eventually wake up and begin questioning its own assumptions. The Enlightenment was coming, and with it, a completely different way of thinking about the mind, about illness, and about what it means to be human. For centuries, mental illness had been explained by gods, demons, spirits, curses, or moral failure. Now a new generation began asking a different question. What if these people were simply sick? What if they needed treatment? Not punishment, not fear, treatment. One man became the symbol of that shift, Philippe Pinel, in revolutionary France. A story emerged that would become legendary. Pinel walked into an asylum and ordered the chains removed. Patients who had been treated like animals were suddenly treated like people. Whether the story happened exactly that way is debated, but the idea changed everything because the message was powerful. Mental illness was not a crime. It was not a sin. It was an illness, and illnesses should be treated, not punished. Across the English Channel, another reformer reached a similar conclusion. His name was William Tuke. He looked at existing asylums and saw suffering everywhere. Chains, isolation, fear, control. So he built something different. The York Retreat, a place based on a radical idea, kindness. Patients spent time outdoors. They worked, they socialized, they were treated with dignity. And something remarkable happened. The outcomes improved, because it turns out people recover better when they are treated like human beings. A lesson history keeps forgetting, and then learning again. For a moment, It seemed progress was unstoppable. Humanity was winning. Science was advancing. Compassion was growing. The future looked bright. Then, the 19th century arrived, and everything became more complicated. Industrial societies were growing rapidly. Cities expanded. Populations exploded. And suddenly there were far more patients than anyone knew how to help. The answer seemed obvious. Build more institutions. Build more hospitals. Build more asylums. At first, the idea sounded reasonable. Specialized facilities, professional care, dedicated staff, treatment, hope. But reality had other plans. The number of patients kept growing, faster than anyone expected. Hospitals filled up. Then they overflowed. New buildings were constructed. Then those filled up too. The system kept expanding. But demand expanded even faster. What began as a humanitarian project slowly became a logistical nightmare. Doctors were overwhelmed. Staff were overwhelmed. Entire institutions were overwhelmed. The problem was no longer compassion. The problem was scale. How do you care for thousands of people at once? No one had a good answer. And so the wards grew larger. The hallways grew longer. The patient lists grew endless. One patient became 10. 10 became 100. 100 became 1,000. And something important was lost: individuality. The more patients arrived, the harder it became to see the person behind the diagnosis. People became records. Records became numbers. And numbers became easy to ignore. The institutions were not built to be cruel. Most were built to help. But systems can create suffering, even when nobody intends them to. History has shown that again and again, yet even inside those overcrowded walls, science continued moving forward. Doctors kept observing, kept recording, kept comparing, kept searching for patterns. Because if mental illness was a medical condition, then it had to follow rules. There had to be causes. There had to be categories. There had to be explanations. One physician became especially influential. His name was Emil Kraepelin. He spent years studying patients. Not for hours, not for days, for years. And he noticed something important. Different conditions behaved differently. Different symptoms followed different paths. Different disorders produced different outcomes. That might sound obvious today. Back then, it was revolutionary, because it suggested something profound. Mental illness was not one thing. It was many things. Different conditions, different causes, different futures. Modern psychiatry was beginning to take shape. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. For the first time, researchers were trying to classify mental illness systematically. Not through religion, not through superstition, not through fear, through observation, through evidence, through science. The knowledge was improving, but knowledge alone was not enough, because understanding suffering and caring for people who suffer are not the same thing. History makes that lesson painfully clear. Babylon tried to help, but misunderstood the cause. Rome developed medical theories, but created systems that could be abused. The Enlightenment promoted dignity, but eventually built overcrowded institutions. Every generation solved one problem and created another. Every generation believed it finally understood, and every generation was only partly right. Today, we know more about the brain than any civilization before us. We understand trauma, genetics, psychology, neurology. We have treatments that work, therapies that help, medications that save lives, knowledge that ancient physicians could never have imagined. And yet, one question remains unchanged, a question older than psychiatry, older than medicine, older than history itself. What do we owe people who suffer? Not how do we classify them, not how do we diagnose them, not how do we explain them. What do we owe them? That question appears everywhere in history. In Babylon, in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome, in Baghdad, in medieval villages, in modern hospitals, and the answer has never been purely scientific. Because science can explain suffering, but it cannot decide how we respond to it. That choice belongs to us. Always. The most humane moments in history rarely came from the most advanced theories. They came from people who chose compassion, people who chose dignity, people who chose inclusion, People who refused to look away. The people of Gilles, Avicenna, William Tuke, Philippe Pinel. Different centuries, different cultures, different beliefs. Yet all of them shared one simple idea. A suffering person is still a person. A struggling person still belongs. And no amount of science can replace that truth. Because the story of mental illness was never only about medicine. It was about humanity. And that story is still being written today. Today, we know more about the human mind than any civilization before us. We understand trauma, genetics, psychology, neurology. We have treatments that work, therapies that help, knowledge that ancient physicians could never have imagined. And yet, one question remains. A question older than psychiatry, older than medicine, older than history itself. What do we owe people who suffer? Not how do we classify them, not how do we diagnose them, not how do we explain them. What do we owe them? Because science can explain suffering, but it cannot decide how we respond to it. That choice belongs to us. Always, the most humane moments in history rarely came from the most advanced theories. They came from people who chose compassion, people who chose dignity, people who chose inclusion, people who refused to look away. Different centuries, different cultures, different beliefs. Yet they all shared one simple idea. A suffering person is still a person. A struggling person still belongs. And no amount of science can replace that truth. Because the story of mental illness was never only about medicine. It was about humanity. And that story is still being written today.